Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to a very special episode of the Web Platform Podcast. We're recording live in Krakow, Poland. We're at the Google Developer Days Summit here in Europe, and we have a very, very special guest with us today, Wendy Ginsberg. She's the product manager for the Polymer team. And hello, Wendy. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here.
Yeah, we're very excited to have you. So do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So as you said, I'm Wendy Ginsberg. I'm the product manager on the Polymer team. And more specifically, I'm a product manager on the Chrome web platform team at Google, with Polymer as the specialty.
That's exciting. And so as a product manager for Polymer, how did you get into this role? Could you tell us a little bit about, were you on other teams at Google before this? What was your journey into the Polymer team?
Yeah, so I started at Google through the Associate Product Manager program, or the APM program. And so my first year, I was on the Google Store, store.google.com. It's where we sell all our hardware, like Chromecasts and Pixel phones. And that was part of the Android org. And then the deal with that program is after the first year, you can pick a new role. The first one was kind of random. And so you get like a list of 100 roles. And by far, this Polymer was the most exciting one to me. It really jumped out. And I met with my current manager, Alex Komorowski, and I met with Taylor Savage and Matt McNulty. And after that, I was just totally sold. So I put it first.
That's amazing. I don't blame you. I think the Polymer community is, and especially the core team, is the one that I have the most nerd crushes on. So your team is kind of amazing.
Yeah, me too.
And so I'm wondering, what was the team like when you joined, and where was Polymer at the time? Were you what version release were you on, and where in the journey were you?
Sure. So the team was exactly the same size as it is now. In terms of people, we definitely have the right amount of people to be doing what we're doing. And the stage we were at, it was about a little over a year ago, and we were getting ready for the Polymer Summit in London. And as you know, we released our 2.0 preview then. So it had been, about a year and a half since we had released 1.0, and this was a huge time, and that's what I came into. And I don't think I realized how crazy it was when I was there, because it was all just crazy in general. But in hindsight, yeah, it was pretty hectic.
You definitely hit the ground running, to say the least. So a year or more in as a PM, what's your day to day? What do you do on a daily basis? What type of decisions are you making as a product manager?
Sure. Yeah, there's about 3 areas I would say that I focus on. The first one is just the Polymer project, helping with sprints, helping make sure that we have documentation for all the projects we're running, that none of the teams are blocked, that they're communicating, or as Monica says, I go to meetings so they don't have to. And then the other 2 areas are growth and metrics and community development. So growth and metrics, when I first got here, we had some metrics, but we didn't quite know what our impact was, because we weren't quite at that stage it didn't really matter. We were just trying to get it to work. And so I immediately set up our metrics. I pull those every month. I monitor them and share them, both with my manager and his manager and the other teams at Google. And the other thing that, I said is community development and outreach. And that's why I'm here at these events. I talk to developers, I get feedback, I give talks, write blog posts, all that.
Yeah. Wow, that's incredible. Such an exciting role. So focusing on the community development piece, what types of outreach do you do as a PM? Like, there's the summit, and what other types of community events do you guys run in the various countries?
Yeah, so recently we've been plugging into local Polymer meetup groups. So we went to Sydney, Vancouver, Madrid. There's a couple other cities that are starting to now build more and more Polymer meetup groups or web components meetup groups, whereas previously it was like we'd plug into JavaScript groups. Like I went to Women Who Code London when I was there. And that's more, the past few months. And then there's a lot of Google events that we do try to go to. I've started trying to go to just like really popular local events in markets that we haven't been to. So I was at JFocus in Stockholm, which is traditionally a Java developers conference, but it is in the past couple of years started to add more JavaScript and web. And I thought, Scandinavia, we don't often go there. This was before we knew we were going to Copenhagen, and decided to just, hey, people like it here, so go to that conference.
That is super cool. And I think Vaadin has made Java and web components a cool thing. So
yeah, the Vaadin team is incredible.
Kudos to Vaadin. And so that's really exciting. And so what about the browser herding piece? So I imagine a big part of your role as product manager is really kind of, working with browser vendors on agreeing to specs and whatnot. And how much of your job is doing that, and what's it like?
Yeah, so my manager is, I mentioned before, Alex Komorowski, who was the original PM of Polymer years ago. He has this metaphor that he often talks about, and he gives us advice. He calls it like the elastic band theory. So he says, imagine that, all the browsers live together in this rubber band, this elastic band. And that means that if one browser tries to move ahead or gets left behind, the other browsers can't move too far away, or the band snaps and the web breaks. So that's what he always shares with us. It's a very strategic, long-term play, because anything you put into the web platform, that's not going anywhere. It's very hard, as we know as a Chrome team, to ever remove anything.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think a lot of developers don't realize like how kind of strenuous like these decisions are when new features are being introduced, and like what those APIs are, because you're right, once it's out, it's out. It's really difficult to kind of deprecate and backtrack. It would be awesome, but unfortunately, people can't check out different versions of a browser.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a good idea though.
Yeah.
And so I guess how long? I mean, like, what's the timeline like? So let's say the Polymer team comes up with a really cool feature that they want to implement. How long does it really take to kind of get into Chrome and then potentially other browsers? Like, what's that?
This is something I've been trying to learn a lot more about, particularly in the few weeks before the summit, and especially right after the summit, because we do have TPAC coming up with the W3C, like kind of spec convention thingy. And it's tough. I think this is a terrible answer, but it really depends. So something like Service Worker, which is just a brand new technology that doesn't really replace anything, that would go faster because everyone's like, oh, this is brand new, and it really brings something to the table. Something that fundamentally changes the way things work, that's a different story. So you see with web components, it was a longer journey because it was a really fundamental change, and browsers wanted to make sure we got it right. So hence why we had V0 and then V1.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, and that leads me into my next question nicely, which is, web components versus Polymer. So can you, for our listeners, kind of clarify that? And I guess maybe what is a vanilla web component, right? Versus a Polymer web component? Yeah,
that question was way easier to answer maybe in 1.0 stages, because if you looked at a Polymer element, and then you looked at a quote-unquote vanilla web component, they were very different. We had this factory method for Polymer. There was quite a bit of weirdness or magic. But as we adopted ES6 classes for 2.0, and especially now as we're moving into ES modules, you can't really tell the difference anymore. So the phrase vanilla web components used to be quite descriptive. It was something that, if you looked at the code, you really couldn't tell what it was made with. But now that's more of a buzzword and something people throw around, because Polymer is really vanilla. It's just mix-ins at this point to make it easier to build those web components. So we're also super small and unopinionated. We've shrunk like 4 or 5 times between versions. And you could see from like the other libraries that have been showing up, just want to give a shout out to some of those. We got like Svelte just released something recently, of course, Stencil from Ionic and Glimmer from Ember, and there's Xtag and Brom and Skate. And of course, Vaadin has their components and Gluon. It just, now there's a million ways to make it easier to build web components, and all of them are super small. That's just the common denominator.
Yeah, and that's really important for mobile web, right? And so, do you have any success stories that you can kind of maybe share with us on some companies that have adopted web components and made that transition from maybe another monolithic legacy app into web components? Yeah, absolutely. So there's lots of companies that have used Polymer. We usually try to highlight some of them at our events. Really popular in Google. I'd say main companies you would heard of, Coca-Cola, EA, YouTube, McDonald's, GE, Comcast, IBM, NASA.
lots of Salesforce, lots of these companies. But I think where you see the real value of web components, and like you mentioned before, mobile web is with Ola Cabs in India. I wish I had the stats offhand, but they built a progressive web app with Polymer that they spoke about at I/O at the main mobile web keynote. And I mean, they were just tremendously successful. And what it enabled them to do was reach users in what they call these tier 2 cities that wouldn't normally have access to their app because they just wouldn't download it. They wouldn't have the bandwidth to download it, and they could just kind of use it one-off. And they have just a really great offline experience too in terms of design. So I think that's my favorite success story.
Yeah, I remember that keynote. It was pretty powerful.
Yeah.
And I like the live order of
the
taxi.
They had to cancel that.
That was pretty funny. I'm a big fan of trying to stick with just JavaScript when possible, and so the adoption to use ES6 modules for Polymer is huge, and obviously it's given you guys a lot of leverage automatically with not needing polyfills for imports and things like that. So can you kind of speak a little bit more about like what, so that it's going to be version 3 that's going to have that feature. Yep. And so can you kind of speak a little bit more to what timelines are? And
Sure. There is a great slide that I wish I could summon and express over this microphone from Fred Schott's talk at the summit, which kind of has each month and what we plan to do for each thing. I can see us for the next few months doing a lot of testing and iterating really fast. We're lucky enough to have lots of people diving in and trying this stuff, even though it's like super half-baked. And hopefully, because we're not really changing the API and it's mostly based on external things, hopefully we can get 3.0 out by the end of the year. It was purposely a very small, it was a version change because like according to Semver rules, it had to be a version change, but we specifically wanted to keep it simple.
Yeah, so that's really exciting. So version 3 is mainly going to be the rewrite and the shift towards adopting ES6 modules, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, and also just switching from Bower to NPM, so just tiny file path things as well.
Yeah, no, that's really huge and very exciting. And so with that said, maybe we can talk a little bit about webcomponents.org.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what that is, and and I guess where it started and where it is today?
Sure. So quite literally, where it started was in Sydney. We used to have a bunch of engineers, or a couple engineers on our team based out of Sydney, and they essentially built webcomponents.org as a unit there. And it was, there were a couple web components aggregators out there beforehand, and I'm really grateful for just people in the community who put those up. We realized that there was a need for something more substantial that had vetted, GitHub stats present and live demos and better search. And so we decided that it was sort of our responsibility, if we were trying to build this web components community, to build a web components community online that we could put everything and that people could trust. So it wasn't just like, a bunch of jQuery plugins on the web and you kind of just download it and try it. So it launched in January, kind of in a beta-ish time. And since then, now I think last I checked, there are about almost 1,200 components up there. And this is, from various community members, but also from different companies. IBM Research has some components up there. I know the Chromecast team, those are really popular because, lots of media apps, they want to put cast buttons in. We've seen the Google publisher tag. So now developers who know nothing about ads can monetize their apps really easily. I personally, as a developer, I love it. Frankie, who's kind of our lead on building apps on our team, he loves it. And it's kind of the gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, when I think of web components, I think, there has to be some magical repository somewhere on the internet where you can find all of these things, right? And you can kind of assemble your own website, or web app, right? And Monica had this really great talk at the Polymer Summit, which I encourage everyone to listen to. But like the whole crafter versus assembler analogy. Can you maybe speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's something. There are a couple threads that keep popping up, whether it's when we talk to community members or we talk to like partners or teams at Google. And one of them that we started hearing loud and clear was crafters versus assemblers. And it's something that Monica really connected with. There are a lot of ideas that, kind of surface. Like Monica recently was talking about how Polymer is like the jQuery of web components. And also this crafters versus assemblers thing. It's like she hears it and then she just keeps kind of beating the drum in the community and if she really believes it. And so I'm glad she talked about it because it's something I think the team just like knows is truth, but we don't often talk about it. And that has a lot to do with where we're going in the future. Because when we think about our users, quote unquote, or our developers, quote unquote, we have to clarify often, are you talking about people building web components, or are you talking about people using web components? Because they're two different types of users, two different use cases.
Absolutely. I mean, and the other level is also that, if we're constantly crafting our own custom solutions, we're not able to move as fast, right?
Oh,
and
yeah,
I think
the
that's
farming and the furniture building.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's such a great analogy. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, that's something we also talk about. And especially with our developer relations and developer advocates folks, because they're excellent web developers. They've been doing this stuff forever. That is why this is their job. And oftentimes we see them building everything from scratch, and I get intimidated by that often. As a personal developer, I'm all self-taught, other than college where they don't really teach web, and I personally couldn't do that. So something like Polymer really connects to me. And Monica was just trying to tell people, that's okay. That's actually pretty normal. The fact that you don't want to rewrite code. Kevin shared this quote. The best line of code is one that you didn't have to write yourself, and I totally agree with that. So I think it's a really important thing for developers to hear. You don't have to reinvent everything every time.
I think hearing that from someone like Monica, I think it's like a come to Jesus moment that I think we really needed. So that was I really enjoyed that talk. And so can you talk a little bit about companies that are when my old company first started to adopt component style architecture, the first thing they talk about is, hey, we're going to make a component library, right? So can you talk a little bit about what patterns and trends you're seeing for people using their own kind of internal library, and what tools are potentially available around theming and kind of managing that?
So I think the first thing is what patterns do large companies have, and the second one is theming. So the first thing, we can talk about this all we want as the Polymer team, but it's not quite the same as if we bring a partner to talk about it. Right. And luckily, we've had 2 great talks on the topic. Last Polymer Summit, ING talked about it, or the CIO of ING, Ben Issa, was talking about how it really just changed the way all of his teams were structured and allowed them to innovate faster amongst their 24 or something offices around the world. Because they had this shared language and just shared components that were completely interoperable. And then this year, USA Today, or the Gannett team, they had one of their UX leads up there, and she was amazing. She talked about, they had all these different websites, all these different publishers, because they don't just run USA Today, they run tons of different sites. And they wanted to have a consistent look and feel because their journalists were getting frustrated. They didn't know how their different articles would show up, and the design teams didn't know how to prepare for it. And so they just kind of took this rip it all out, ground up. How do we redesign our entire infrastructure? And she'll explain it way better than I can right now. So I really encourage you to, if you're interested in that, just listen to them.
Yeah, no, that's such a great point. And what about maybe slightly controversial topic, but for companies that are not open source, that are maybe reinventing their own wheel all the time?
Yeah.
Any stories around that you're comfortable sharing?
Yeah. So I want to remember to touch on theming after this because I forgot to. But I think a lot of companies, or especially large companies, and they just have super conservative lawyers. They're not that don't quite process. Hey, this is all client side code. If I want to open all of it, I can read it. So they might not expose their components. However, we do know that a lot of partners will get components off of webcomponents.org. I was just talking to Kunal Kudaje from Netflix, who is speaking at the summit about this. Vaadin is really popular at Google and really popular with partners, and so are a bunch of other smaller components in general. It's just they can take from us and from webcomponents.org. They might not contribute back. But yeah, on the note of theming, that's something that we're looking into a lot moving forward. There's an engineer on the team named Dan who's super interested in this stuff. The EA shares on this a little bit because they have a shared set of components, but they reskin them every time when they want to release a new website for a new game. And so that's kind of the fun part for them. That's the 80% innovation time that they spend that Alex talks about in his talk.
That's awesome. That's great to hear. And so what other libraries are you seeing kind of pop up around web components? I know you mentioned a couple earlier.
Yeah.
Can you maybe speak to those?
Sure. Yeah. So I did. We do kind of keep track of this because I think this is a really big sign of maturity. This was part of sort of the theme at the summit this year. But when you start seeing, these other frameworks, like major frameworks, start changing the way that they work so that they can be more interoperable. And when you start seeing other libraries based on the same specs you've been working on, I mean, that's an immense sign of maturity. So I think I'll list them again. So there's Svelte that announced recently, Gluon, which is kind of a smaller version of Polymer, Vaadin, of course, it's a library of components, Skate.js, which is by Trey Shugart. He's incredible and brilliant, and he's been doing a lot of innovative stuff when it comes to like server-side rendering, which you spoke about at the summit. There's Brahm, which I heard about recently, Xtag, which I think there might be another version coming out soon. That's just completely my personal like tinfoil hat guess. Stencil, which was announced by Ionic at the Polymer Summit, and Glimmer, which is a JavaScript library that can compile into web components from Ember, which is really cool.
Yeah, Glimmer is kind of amazing. We really should have him on our show. So I think also true success is really when those projects get forked a few times, then you've really made it big. So
I mean, I really love how there's a ton of options and for developers to just try stuff. I mean,
it's awesome.
Even for stuff that's closer to that just changes the developer experience a little bit and is maybe closer to what someone might be used to in general.
Yeah, absolutely. And Custom Elements is a site that got released a few weeks ago. Rob Dotson, who's on your team, created that. Do you want to speak a little bit about what it is?
Yeah, so Custom Elements everywhere. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's also this other section now on /web or like developers.google.com/web. And I need to give tremendous shout out and kudos to Rob, who does so many things. He's amazing and awesome, but he put a lot of work into that and a lot of time, and you can tell there was a lot of care. Like Rob really cares about making sure that interop story is told, and that people understand, these APIs independently, and that web components doesn't mean using all 4 of the initial APIs that were initially sent out: Shadow DOM, Custom Elements, Template, and HTML imports. So I'm glad that he sort of pulled out Custom Elements and explained how it can be used independently.
Yeah, and I think the interoperability piece is huge, and it's an opportunity for people, writing in React and Angular or Ember to really start creating their own web components, right? Yeah. And to be able to eventually convert them if they want to. So that's really exciting. All right. Well, it's been awesome. I guess some wrap-up questions. What have you guys been doing for the past few weeks, and what do you hope to share at the next summit?
Yeah, so it's been 3 weeks since the summit ended, just about 3 weeks. And so usually, the summit was Tuesday, Wednesday. Usually the team takes a little bit of vacation. It's definitely encouraged because it's sort of like this mad dash right before the summit. Peter on our team was the only one who couldn't make it this year, but he was home till like 4 a.m, drinking coffee to make sure that our elements got published to NPM. And it's a lot of work. So we encourage everyone to take vacation and try to recover from whatever colds they've gotten. And then when everyone kind of trickles back into the office, which was about, 2-ish weeks ago, we immediately started talking about TPAC, immediately started talking about standards, particularly because when we made the change to switch from HTML imports to ES modules, that brought up a lot of discussions, ones that we as a team had so many times, like arguments and religious battles about it. But then we got to engage with other folks about it, and we realized, we have a lot to say about where this goes, and we want to be able to voice our opinion as effectively and cohesively as possible. So it's just been a lot of lock everyone in a room and just talk it out. Now I'm starting to reach out to the Chrome standards team, just sort of to get their opinion on this and to get their advice moving forward.
Wow, that's just a small insight into your life. That's pretty intense. And so, what news do you hope to share, like in a year from now? In an ideal, totally, like reality does not have to exist at this point. Like, what news do you hope to share with us?
Yeah, like what's the dream?
Mm-hmm.
The dream. Next year, a year from now. Big question. The dream is that the momentum that I've seen pick up in just a few weeks from the summit, I hope that really accelerates, and I hope it at the very least remains like heavy and constant. And by that I mean other libraries taking looks at web components or custom elements, other libraries, frameworks I meant, and other libraries pop up around it, more developers trying it out. I hope to see more growth in webcomponents.org, whether that's by having more components or by just more engagement with the site. I shared some stats, which these ones aren't public. I wish they were. We get, well over 1 million page views a month. And the pages on the site are only components. So the components are viewed well over 1 million times a month. And I'd love to see growth there. Something that we were so sold on and so glad we did at this year's summit was getting community speakers. And I really look forward to doing that again. I hope to expand the way that we do that and maybe having more opportunities for more people, like lightning talks. We did a beginner's code lab this year right before the keynote so that folks who maybe had never used Polymer but just wanted to see what it was about could come, try it out before the keynote. And then when they got there, felt like, okay, at least I know what this is. I've tried it. I've felt it. And I hope to, I'm inspired by that. We were doing a lot of work recently on our onboarding and getting people to, once you get to the site, to try Polymer and see the magic. But I hope to continue doing that as well, understanding how people learn web development and how we can change the way our docs are even designed so that it's less skimming and more reading, because I do skim docs. Everyone skims docs.
I think it's a generational problem. I wouldn't worry too much.
But you know what? Our docs writers, Arthur and Kate, are so passionate about what they do, and they care so much. And what I love about both of them is they have such unique writing styles that they bring to the table. And those are such strengths because they're different. And reading their docs over and over and thinking about the research we've been doing on how people learn, it's sort of helping us think about, okay, well, if we have someone that has a really great storytelling voice and someone that has a really great, specific technical and also kind of humorous voice, how do we highlight those differently on our site and kind of apply them best? So I don't know. That stuff I get excited about, like the doc site. That's a product as well.
Yeah, no, it is. It's all, if you can make things easier for people to ramp up, they're more productive, right? And so you infinitely affect everybody. It's a butterfly effect.
Yeah, there's this UX researcher on the Chrome team who, it took us about a year to get some of his time, but we finally got it. His name is Jason, and he kind of shared this term with us called ego threat, which I totally relate to. And the number one thing on any tutorial or doc site, particularly with coding, that you don't want to do is cause the user or the developer to experience ego threat, where they feel like, wow, this might just be too hard for me. Yeah. And that's not the case. Yeah. That's our responsibility to help people avoid.
Yeah, that's awesome, and perfect segue into my next question. Where can people learn about Polymer? What are the best recommended resources, tutorials, potential courses? If you can kind of share that, and we'll include all of the links in our show notes. So
sure,
feel free to just list them off.
I usually have such a specific answer for this, but like I said, in the past few months, things have they've exploded. So there's a Lynda course now. There's tutorials on our site. And those are going to be changing very fast because we're working on them. But we also have code labs that were just launched at the Summit and at I.O. There's one on Purple with custom elements in Firebase. There's one on better animations, just smoother, more native animations. There's one on building your first ever kind of app game with Polymer. You can find all of those on codelabs.developers.google.com or on the Summit site itself. And if you're already a developer that's using other frameworks, or you're, a very, very experienced web developer and you kind of just want to try it out, we pretty much retweet, from Polymer, anything that is super interesting about Polymer and X or Polymer and Y, because we know a lot of people are interested in that. Web development, nothing exists in a bubble. Everything always ends up being with something else. So if you pay attention to our Twitter stream, you'll probably encounter just a lot of great content that way.
That's awesome. Yeah, we'll link to the feed in our show notes.
Yeah, and I'll add some links, just the latest with Polymer. Like if you want to try the newest stuff, we have 2 blog posts online that explains why we made all these changes and also how you can try them.
Yeah, no, that's great. We'll get all those links from you. And actually, you just reminded me of something I wanted to discuss, but we didn't get a chance to, is animation. So what's the story with Polymer and animations? If you could kind of briefly talk about that.
Yeah, we we got asked this at the summit. I did quite a bit. We have a blog post up called, basically like what's happening with neon animations that Elliot, one of the awesome developers on our team, wrote. Because neon animations used to be this like set of elements that we had, but then we realized, they don't quite do what we would tell people to do. So we just are sort of sunsetting them. But Valdrin on our team made that code lab for expand collapse animations. And I think for me, I learned a lot because I just completely avoided CSS animations like the plague. Like I didn't just transform, none of that. And I always wanted, a jQuery or something to do it for me. So I learned a lot from that code lab, which I recommend if you've never dipped your toe into CSS animations to check it out. The other thing, which I guess I didn't really mention in terms of next steps, you could imagine that we're thinking about what to do with our elements, the Polymer elements, and we're currently in research phase. Steve touched on this in his talk a little bit because he's leading the engineering side of the elements project. And a lot of what we're looking at is animations, because how can you make flyweight animations? How can you make, our paper ripple really fast and really easy? And that was actually one of my favorite meetings in the past few months, was just seeing like some of the really wacky ideas that the team had for how to fix that.
Yeah. That's incredible. I will link all of that in the show notes. And with that said, really thank you so much for your time. This has been so fun. Any last words of wisdom?
I don't know. I just think that first of all, I love that this web platform podcast exists. And if you're someone listening to this, I think it's really great that people think about the web platform as a whole, instead of trying to cut it by framework or cut it by browser or cut it by programming language. Because at the end of the day, the user who's using your app does not know about this. I mean, my grandparents told me they use Chrome, and I'm not sure if they do or if they use Internet Explorer. Like most people don't even know what a browser is. So it's important to think about just the web platform as a whole and what's going to give your user the best experience first. And also remember, what's going to give you the best experience as a developer. You can't, just be building everything completely vanilla all the time or completely plain JavaScript all the time, because that's going to be a tough on you. So think about both the user and your own experience, and think about it holistically.
Yeah, that's incredible. Wise words were never spoken. Wiser words. And so where can we find you on the internet?
Oh, man. So Twitter, WM Ginsberg with an S and an E in Ginsberg. And then my Twitter and my GitHub are the same. I usually don't... I develop a lot of web stuff personally, but most of the stuff on GitHub is just like silly Python things. And I do quite a bit of hardware as well. So
that's exciting. Well, with that said, we're really excited to have you as a guest. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. That's a wrap.
Awesome.